The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Atlanta's municipal court, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Judge William Harrison sat high on his bench, his gray hair neatly combed and his black robe pressed to perfection. At 62 years old, he had spent over 2 decades handling cases in this very courtroom. It was just another Tuesday morning in March, and the court calendar was filled with the usual traffic violations and minor offenses. Judge Harrison's face showed no emotion as he mechanically worked through case after case, his voice carrying the same stern tone he had perfected over the years. "Next case," he called out, not bothering to look up from his papers. The bailiff's voice echoed through the courtroom. "Case number 2347, Dr. Maya Bennett, parking violation on Highland Avenue." A woman in her early 40s walked forward to the defendant's podium. She wore a simple navy blue blazer and matching pants, her natural hair styled professionally. Despite her calm demeanor, there was something dignified about her presence that usually commanded respect in any room she entered. Today, however, seemed different. Judge Harrison barely glanced at her as he shuffled through the citation papers. "Miss Bennett, you're charged with parking in a restricted zone during peak hours. How do you plead?" "It's Dr. Bennett, Your Honor," she corrected politely. "And if I may explain the circumstances." The question was simple. Harrison interrupted, his voice carrying a hint of irritation. "How do you plead to the parking violation?" Dr. Bennett took a deep breath. "Guilty with an explanation, Your Honor. I was attending to an emergency. The sign clearly states no parking between 7 a.m. and 9 a.m. Harrison cut her off again. "The officer's notes indicate your vehicle was there at 8:15 a.m. These restrictions are in place for a reason." The courtroom had grown quieter than usual. The few people sitting in the gallery could feel the tension building. The court clerk, Mrs. Rodriguez, looked uncomfortable as she typed the proceedings into her computer. "Your Honor," Dr. Bennett tried again, her voice steady but firm. "I'm a neurosurgeon at Atlanta General. That morning, I received an urgent call about a patient with a brain aneurysm. Every minute." "Dr. Bennett," Harrison said, emphasizing her title with a tone that bordered on mockery. "The law applies equally to everyone, regardless of their profession. You could have found legal parking or used the hospital's designated areas." He didn't notice the slight shake of the bailiff's head or the way Mrs. Rodriguez's fingers had stopped typing. Instead, he reached for his gavel, ready to pronounce the fine. "The court finds you guilty of violating City Code 34-26. You are hereby fined $500, to be paid within 30 days. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. Dr. Bennett stood there for a moment, her expression unchanged but her eyes reflecting a mixture of disappointment and resignation. She had seen this before, the dismissive attitude, the unwillingness to listen, the quick assumptions. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said quietly. "I'll be sure to submit a formal complaint about this interaction to the Judicial Review Board." For the first time that morning, Harrison looked directly at her, slightly taken aback by her composed confidence. But before he could respond, she had already turned and was walking toward the exit, her heels clicking steadily against the floor. As she reached the courtroom doors, a young intern from the hospital rushed in, almost colliding with her. "Dr. Bennett, the patient's family is here. They want to thank you for saving their daughter's life yesterday." The intern's voice trailed off as he realized where they were, but his words had already rippled through the courtroom. Several heads turned, including Mrs. Rodriguez, who was now frantically typing something into her computer. Judge Harrison was already calling the next case, but a slight furrow had appeared in his brow. Something about this interaction felt different, unsettling. Little did he know, his seemingly routine morning decision would soon force him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and the system he represented. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, but somehow, the shadows in the courtroom seemed to have grown longer. Judge Harrison sat in his chambers during lunch break, unwrapping the turkey sandwich his wife had packed for him. His morning session had left him with an unusual feeling of unease, though he couldn't exactly explain why. He had handled dozens of cases today, just like any other day. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called out, expecting his usual afternoon coffee delivery. Instead, Mrs. Rodriguez, his court clerk of 15 years, entered with an awkward expression on her face. In her hands, she carried a stack of newspapers and what appeared to be several medical journals. Her usually confident stride was hesitant. "Judge Harrison," she began, clearing her throat. "I think there's something you should see about Dr. Bennett from this morning's session." He raised an eyebrow, putting down his sandwich. "The parking violation case." "What about it?" Mrs. Rodriguez spread the materials across his desk. There, on the cover of Atlanta Medical Review, was Dr. Maya Bennett's face. She was wearing surgical scrubs, looking much different from the woman who had stood in his courtroom just hours ago. The headline read, "Revolutionary Brain Surgery Technique Saves Hundreds. Dr. Maya Bennett's Innovation Changes Lives." Harrison's throat went dry. He picked up another magazine, dated just 2 months ago. Top 50 Most Influential Doctors in America. Dr. Bennett's name was at number 3. "There's more," Mrs. Rodriguez said quietly, pointing to a newspaper article. "She performed emergency surgery this morning, right after leaving our courtroom. Saved a 12-year-old girl's life. The parking violation happened because she was rushing to the hospital for this case." Harrison's hands began to feel clammy as he read through the articles. Dr. Maya Bennett wasn't just any surgeon. She had developed a new technique for treating brain aneurysms that had reduced the mortality rate by 60%. She ran a free clinic in one of Atlanta's poorest neighborhoods every weekend. She had received the Presidential Medal of Excellence in Medicine last year. "She was trying to tell me about the emergency," he muttered, remembering how he had cut her off. The weight of his morning's behavior began to sink in. Mrs. Rodriguez nodded slowly. "The hospital called twice while you were in session, trying to verify if she was still here. Apparently, she was the only surgeon in the state qualified to perform the procedure the girl needed." Harrison stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the city skyline. His reflection in the glass showed a man who suddenly looked older, tired. He thought about how he had spoken to her, the dismissive tone he had used, the way he had mocked her title. "Do you know what else I found out?" Mrs. Rodriguez continued, her voice gentle but firm. "That girl she saved this morning? She was the daughter of one of our regular court officers, Officer Jenkins. His daughter Sarah had been rushed to Atlanta General with a ruptured aneurysm. Dr. Bennett got there just in time." The judge turned back to his desk and picked up another article. This one showed Dr. Bennett speaking at a medical conference, teaching her innovative techniques to a room full of other surgeons. The respect and authority she commanded were evident in the photograph. "I made a terrible mistake, haven't I, Maria?" he asked his clerk, using her first name for the first time in years. Mrs. Rodriguez stood quietly for a moment. "We all make assumptions, Judge. The question is what we do after we realize they're wrong." Harrison sat heavily in his chair, pushing his lunch aside. He began reading through every article, every achievement, every life Dr. Bennett had touched. The more he read, the more his earlier behavior haunted him. "Find out how to contact her office," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "And Maria, thank you for bringing this to my attention." As Mrs. Rodriguez left his chambers, Judge Harrison remained at his desk, surrounded by evidence of Dr. Bennett's remarkable career and impact. His sandwich lay forgotten as the afternoon sun cast shadows across the articles that had shattered his presumptions and forced him to face an uncomfortable truth about himself. That evening, Judge Harrison couldn't bring himself to leave his office at his usual time of 5:00 p.m. Instead, he sat at his computer, the bright screen illuminating his troubled face as he searched for more information about Dr. Maya Bennett. Each new discovery made his heart sink further. He clicked through an article about her childhood in rural Georgia, where she had been raised by a single mother who worked 3 jobs to support her education. Despite facing poverty and discrimination, young Maya had graduated as valedictorian of her high school at age 16. "William, are you coming home for dinner?" His wife's voice came through his phone speaker. He had completely forgotten to call her. "Not yet, Margaret," he replied, his voice distant. "I need to finish something important." As he continued reading, he learned how Dr. Bennett had worked as a night janitor at her university to help pay for her pre-med studies. She had earned a full scholarship to medical school, but still worked part-time teaching science to inner-city kids. The more he read, the more his earlier behavior seemed unforgivable. A knock on his office door startled him. It was Tom, the evening security guard. "Everything okay, Judge? You're usually long gone by now," Tom said, concerned. Harrison rubbed his tired eyes. "Tom, you've been here a long time. Have you ever met Dr. Maya Bennett?" Tom's face lit up. Dr. Bennett? Sure have. She saved my grandson last year. Brain tumor, other doctors said it was hopeless. But she took on his case for free, spent hours planning a new surgical approach. That woman is an angel walking on earth. Harrison felt his chest tighten. He thanked Tom and turned back to his computer, now reading about Dr. Bennett's medical foundation. She had used her own money to create a scholarship program for minority students who wanted to become doctors. So far, she had helped put 37 students through medical school. His email alert pinged. Mrs. Rodriguez had sent him Dr. Bennett's schedule for the next day. She would be performing 3 surgeries, teaching a class at the medical school, and still finding time to volunteer at her free clinic. Harrison opened his desk drawer and pulled out the court transcript from that morning. Reading his own words made him wince. How many times had he acted this way before? How many other remarkable people had he judged unfairly from his bench? He thought about his own daughter, Sarah, who was in medical school. What if someone had treated her the way he had treated Dr. Bennett? The thought made him uncomfortable. Looking at the clock, he realized it was almost 9:00 p.m. His computer screen showed one last article, a video of Dr. Bennett speaking to a group of young black girls at a science camp. Her words rang in his ears. Don't let anyone define your worth. Your brain, your determination, and your compassion are what matter. Harrison finally shut down his computer and gathered his things. The courthouse was quiet now, his footsteps echoing in the empty halls. As he passed his courtroom, he paused, looking at the bench where he sat every day making decisions that affected people's lives. In the parking lot, he stared at his car's license plate, Judge 1, a vanity plate he had once been so proud of. Now it seemed to mock him. During his drive home, he passed Atlanta General Hospital. The lights were still on in the surgical wing, and he wondered if Dr. Bennett was there, saving another life while he had spent his day passing quick judgments from his bench. At a red light, he made a decision. Pulling out his phone, he typed a message to Mrs. Rodriguez. First thing tomorrow, cancel my morning appointments. And please draft a formal letter of apology to Dr. Bennett. I'll need to do some major revisions to our court sensitivity training program. As he pulled into his driveway at home, Harrison knew sleep wouldn't come easily tonight. He had spent 20 years believing he was a fair judge, only to realize that sometimes the harshest judgments were the ones he hadn't even known he was making. His wife was waiting up for him, concerned by his late return. Rough day, she asked. No, he replied quietly. Just an overdue awakening. Judge Harrison barely slept that night. He tossed and turned, his mind replaying the courtroom scene over and over. At 4:30 a.m., he gave up trying to sleep and went downstairs to his home office. Sitting in his old leather chair, he pulled out a photo album from his bookshelf. Inside were pictures from his early days as a judge, his swearing-in ceremony, his first day on the bench, celebrations with family and colleagues. He had been so proud then, so sure of himself and his ability to be fair. Can't sleep? His wife Margaret appeared in the doorway, wearing her blue robe. She knew him well enough to sense when something was truly bothering him. I made a terrible mistake yesterday, he admitted, his voice heavy. The kind that makes you question everything you've done for the past 20 years. Margaret sat down across from him, listening as he told her about Dr. Bennett, the parking ticket, and everything he had learned afterward. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Remember when our Sarah was born? She finally asked. The doctors said she might not make it. Remember that black nurse who stayed with me all night, even after her shift ended? Harrison nodded slowly. He had forgotten about that night, about how that nurse had comforted them, fought for them, maybe even saved their daughter's life. Did I ever treat her the same way? He wondered aloud. Did I ever have her in my courtroom and speak to her like I spoke to Dr. Bennett? He walked to his window, watching the sky slowly brighten with the approaching dawn. 20 years of cases began flooding his mind. How many times had he rushed to judgment? How many stories had he refused to hear? His phone buzzed, a text from Mrs. Rodriguez. Dr. Bennett is performing emergency surgery at 6 a.m. The hospital says she's been there all night with a critical patient. Harrison looked at his reflection in the window. His face seemed different somehow, older but also humbled. He thought about all the times he had proudly told people at parties that he was a judge, how he had enjoyed the respect that came with the position. What are you going to do? Margaret asked, knowing her husband was wrestling with something big. He turned to face her. I need to change, Margaret. Not just apologize to Dr. Bennett, but really change. The whole system needs to change. His wife smiled softly. Then you better get dressed. Sounds like you have a lot of work to do. By 7 a.m., Harrison was at his desk in the courthouse, doing something he had never done before, reviewing his past cases. He specifically pulled files where he had interrupted defendants, where he had made quick judgments, where he might have let his biases affect his decisions. Mrs. Rodriguez found him surrounded by case files when she arrived. Judge Harrison, your morning appointments have been canceled as requested. Thank you, Maria, he said, looking up from a particularly troubling case. Could you also get me the contact information for the State Judicial Training Board? And maybe some coffee. It's going to be a long day. As he read through old cases, patterns began to emerge that made him increasingly uncomfortable. His different treatment of people based on their appearance, their way of speaking, their names. It was all there in black and white. The morning sun filled his office as he worked, making notes, marking cases that needed review, writing down ideas for changes. On his desk, Dr. Bennett's file lay open, no longer just a simple parking violation, but a mirror showing him truths he had avoided for too long. His phone rang, the hospital administrator returning his call about meeting with Dr. Bennett. She'll be in surgery until noon, the administrator said, but she has agreed to meet with you afterward. Harrison thanked him and hung up, his heart beating faster. In a few hours, he would face Dr. Bennett again, not as the arrogant judge from yesterday, but as a man beginning to understand the weight of his own prejudices and the urgent need for change. Time to face the truth, he whispered to himself, straightening his bow tie in preparation for perhaps the most important meeting of his career. At exactly 12:30 p.m., Judge Harrison stood in the main lobby of Atlanta General Hospital. His hands were sweaty, and for the first time in decades, he felt nervous about meeting someone. The hospital buzzed with activity around him, nurses rushing past, families waiting anxiously, doctors discussing cases in hushed tones. Judge Harrison, a young intern approached him. Dr. Bennett will see you now. Please follow me. As they walked through the hospital corridors, Harrison noticed how different this environment was from his courtroom. Here, people were focused on saving lives, not passing judgment. The walls displayed photos of successful surgeries and grateful patients, many of them showing Dr. Bennett's smiling face alongside recovered patients. The intern led him to a small office on the third floor. Through the window, he could see Dr. Bennett finishing up some paperwork. She looked tired but focused, still wearing her surgical scrubs with a white coat over them. Doctor, the intern called softly. Judge Harrison is here. Dr. Bennett looked up, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp and alert. She gestured for him to enter, and Harrison felt like their roles had suddenly reversed. Now he was the one being judged. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, Dr. Bennett, he said, his voice lacking its usual courtroom authority. I have 15 minutes before my next surgery, she replied calmly, pointing to a chair. Please, sit. Harrison sat down, noticing the many awards and certificates on her walls. One caught his eye, a thank you letter from a child, decorated with colorful drawings. It read, Dear Dr. Bennett, thank you for fixing my mommy's brain. You're my hero. I owe you an apology, Harrison began, forcing himself to meet her gaze. My behavior yesterday was inexcusable. Dr. Bennett studied him for a moment. Was it inexcusable because of who I turned out to be, Judge Harrison, or would it have been inexcusable regardless of my position? The question hit him hard. She had gone straight to the heart of the matter. Both, he admitted honestly. I've spent the last 24 hours realizing how many times I might have acted the same way to others who didn't have your platform to make me notice my mistake. Dr. Bennett leaned forward slightly. Do you know why I decided to meet with you, Judge? Harrison shook his head. Because that 12-year-old girl I operated on yesterday, her father is Officer Jenkins from your courthouse. While I was saving his daughter's life, he told me about you. He said you're a man capable of growth, capable of change. He believed you would learn from this. Harrison felt his throat tighten. Jenkins had always been one of his most reliable officers, yet he had never really known anything about his family. I want to do better, Harrison said quietly. Not just personally, but systematically. Our court needs changes in how we treat people, how we listen to them, how we judge them. Dr. Bennett checked her watch. I have to prepare for surgery soon, but before I go, I want to show you something. She led him to a window overlooking the hospital's parking lot. See that spot where I parked yesterday, the one that got me the ticket? From here, I can run to the emergency room in exactly 47 seconds. That's often the difference between life and death in my work. Harrison looked at the spot, then back at Dr. Bennett. I never asked why you parked there. I never gave you a chance to explain. No, you didn't, she agreed. But what matters now is what you're going to do about it. Not just for me, but for everyone who enters your courtroom. A nurse appeared at the door. Dr. Bennett, they're ready for you in R3. Dr. Bennett nodded and turned back to Harrison. My secretary will contact you next week. Maybe we can discuss those systematic changes you mentioned. As she walked away, Harrison stood at the window, watching the spot where this whole story had begun. In the reflection of the glass, he saw not just himself, but the weight of responsibility he carried, and the opportunity for real change that lay ahead. A week after their first meeting at the hospital, Judge Harrison sat across from Dr. Bennett in his chambers. This time, the setting was different. He had cleared his entire afternoon schedule, and the usual imposing desk had been replaced by a small round table with 2 comfortable chairs. Thank you for coming, Dr. Bennett, Harrison said, pouring her a cup of coffee. He noticed she looked more rested today, wearing an elegant blue suit instead of surgical scrubs. Before we begin, Dr. Bennett said, placing a thick folder on the table, I'd like to share some stories with you. She opened the folder and pulled out several letters. These are from other medical professionals, mostly women, mostly minorities, who have appeared in various courtrooms across the city. She handed him the first letter. This one is from a nurse who saved 3 lives during a bus accident. She was treated just like I was, over a simple parking ticket. Harrison read the letter slowly, his coffee growing cold. The nurse described how she had been dismissed, interrupted, and treated with contempt, all while trying to explain that she had been rushing to an emergency. There's more, Dr. Bennett continued, pulling out another letter. This one is from a black female paramedic, and this one from an emergency room doctor. The pattern is clear, Judge Harrison. Harrison put down the letters, his face grave. How long have you been collecting these stories? 5 years, she replied. At first, I thought my experience was isolated. Then I started hearing similar stories at medical conferences, in hospital break rooms, even at charity events. She took a sip of her coffee before continuing. But I'm not here to shame you, Judge Harrison. I'm here because you said you wanted to make changes. Real changes. Harrison nodded, pulling out his own folder. I've been doing my own research. I reviewed 5 years of cases in my court. The patterns are disturbing. Different fines for the same violations, different treatment based on appearance, assumptions made without letting people explain their situations. And what do you plan to do about it? Dr. Bennett asked, her voice firm but encouraging. Harrison stood up and walked to his window, then turned back to face her. I have some ideas, but I need your help, your perspective, your experience. For the next 2 hours, they talked openly about the challenges faced by minorities in both the legal and medical systems. Dr. Bennett shared stories of struggling through medical school, of patients who refused to believe she was really a doctor, of colleagues who questioned her abilities despite her achievements. You know what's interesting? She said, looking around his chambers. In medicine, we have a practice called rounds where doctors discuss their cases with colleagues. We admit our mistakes, learn from each other. Does the legal system have anything similar? Harrison shook his head slowly. No, but maybe it should. As their conversation continued, they began drafting ideas on a legal pad. Mandatory cultural sensitivity training for court staff, regular case review sessions, a new system for hearing explanations before making judgments, community feedback sessions. These changes won't be easy, Dr. Bennett warned. You'll face resistance, maybe even ridicule from some of your colleagues. I know, Harrison replied, thinking of some of his more traditional fellow judges, but this is too important to ignore. As their meeting drew to a close, Dr. Bennett stood up to leave but paused at the door. Judge Harrison, do you know why I really agreed to these meetings? He looked at her questioningly. Because in all my years of collecting these stories, you're the first judge who actually asked to learn from their mistake. She smiled slightly. That gives me hope. Harrison watched her leave, then looked down at their notes. Among the formal proposals and policy changes, one simple phrase stood out, written in Dr. Bennett's neat handwriting. Listen first, judge second. He picked up his phone and called Mrs. Rodriguez. Maria, please schedule a meeting with the chief judge. It's time for some changes in our court. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across his chambers, but for the first time in weeks, Judge Harrison felt like he was finally stepping into the light. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and cameras on Monday morning. Word had spread quickly about Judge Harrison's unusual press conference. Local news vans lined the street, and curious onlookers gathered behind the press barriers. Harrison stood inside the courthouse lobby, adjusting his bow tie for the 10th time. Dr. Bennett stood beside him, looking confident in a white doctor's coat over her professional attire. They had spent the past week preparing for this moment. Are you sure about this? Mrs. Rodriguez asked, holding the speech notes. Some of the other judges aren't happy about it. They'll be even less happy in a few minutes, Harrison replied with a slight smile. He looked at Dr. Bennett. Ready? She nodded, and together they walked out onto the courthouse steps. Camera flashes went off immediately, and reporters started calling out questions. Harrison raised his hands for silence. Good morning, he began, his voice carrying across the crowd. 2 weeks ago, in my courtroom, I made a serious mistake, a mistake that opened my eyes to a much bigger problem in our justice system. The reporters grew quiet, sensing this wasn't going to be an ordinary press conference. In the front row, Harrison noticed Officer Jenkins standing with his daughter Sarah, the girl Dr. Bennett had saved. They both smiled encouragingly. I treated a distinguished medical professional, Dr. Maya Bennett, with disrespect and bias, Harrison continued, gesturing to Dr. Bennett. I refused to listen to her explanation about rushing to save a life, and I let my prejudices affect my judgment. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Judges rarely admitted mistakes, especially not in public. But this isn't just about one incident, Harrison said firmly. Dr. Bennett helped me understand that this is about a pattern of behavior that exists throughout our legal system, a pattern that needs to change. He pulled out a folder and held it up. These are new guidelines that will be implemented in my courtroom starting today. They include mandatory cultural sensitivity training for all court staff, regular review of our decisions to check for bias, and a new system that ensures every person gets a fair chance to explain their situation. The cameras clicked rapidly as Harrison handed the folder to Dr. Bennett, who stepped forward to the microphone. As a doctor, I took an oath to help all people equally, she said. Today, Judge Harrison is taking a similar oath. But more importantly, he's acknowledging that good intentions aren't enough. We need systematic changes to ensure true justice. A reporter raised his hand. Judge Harrison, aren't you worried this will make you look weak? Harrison shook his head. What makes us weak is refusing to acknowledge our mistakes and learn from them. What makes us strong is having the courage to change. Dr. Bennett spoke again, her voice clear and strong. This partnership between medical and legal professionals will create new training programs. We'll work together to help judges and court staff understand the realities of emergency workers, healthcare providers, and others who sometimes have to make split-second decisions. More hands went up, but Harrison had one more thing to say. Starting today, the fine I issued to Dr. Bennett will be donated to her Medical Scholarship Foundation, and I'm personally volunteering to work at her free clinic, not as a judge, but as someone who needs to learn more about the community he serves. The announcement caused a stir among the reporters. Officer Jenkins stepped forward with his daughter, and Dr. Bennett put her arm around the young girl's shoulders. This is what justice looks like, Harrison said, pointing to them. A doctor who rushes to save a life, a father who gets to keep his daughter, and a system that learns to listen before it judges. As questions poured in from the reporters, Harrison saw some of his fellow judges watching from the courthouse windows. Some looked angry, others thoughtful. But for the first time in his career, he wasn't concerned about their opinion of him. Because standing there, with Dr. Bennett beside him and the truth finally spoken aloud, he felt more like a real judge than he ever had before. 6 months had passed since the press conference on the courthouse steps. The autumn leaves were falling outside Judge Harrison's window as he reviewed the latest report on his court's changes. The numbers told a remarkable story. Complaints about unfair treatment had dropped by 70%. More people were leaving his courtroom feeling heard, even when the judgment went against them. Other judges in the city had started adopting his new procedures, and 3 more courts in neighboring counties had requested their own training programs. A knock on his door interrupted his reading. Dr. Bennett entered, followed by a group of young medical students wearing white coats. "Judge Harrison," she smiled, "meet your new teachers for today." The students, all from minority backgrounds, were part of Dr. Bennett's scholarship program. Every month now, medical students would spend a day in court, helping judges understand the realities of emergency medical work. In return, law students would spend time at the hospital, learning about the split-second decisions medical staff had to make. "Before we start," Dr. Bennett said, "I thought you might want to see this." She handed him a letter from the state Supreme Court. They had reviewed his new court procedures and wanted to implement them statewide. Harrison smiled, remembering how nervous he'd been 6 months ago. Now, every Saturday, he volunteered at Dr. Bennett's free clinic, not wearing his judge's robe but simple casual clothes. He had learned more there about real people's lives than in 20 years on the bench. "Tell them about last week's case," Mrs. Rodriguez suggested from the doorway. She had become an enthusiastic supporter of the changes, often suggesting new improvements. Harrison turned to the medical students. "Last week, a young nurse came to court for a speeding ticket. Before, I might have just fined her. Instead, I listened. Turned out she was rushing to deliver emergency medicine to a dying patient. Not only did I dismiss the ticket, but we're now working with the hospital to create special emergency permits for medical staff." Officer Jenkins appeared at the door with his daughter Sarah, now fully recovered thanks to Dr. Bennett's surgery. They'd often visited the court to talk to new judges about the importance of listening before judging. "Show them the wall, Judge," Sarah said excitedly. Harrison led the group to what had once been a blank courthouse wall. Now it displayed photos and stories: a paramedic who had saved twins during a snowstorm, a nurse who had walked 3 miles in a hurricane to reach patients, a medical student who had performed CPR on a stranger in a parking lot. "These are our everyday heroes," Harrison explained. "We display their stories to remind everyone in this courthouse that justice isn't just about laws, it's about understanding people's lives." Dr. Bennett touched one of the photos. "And how many parking tickets have you given out lately?" she teased. "Oh, we still give tickets," Harrison chuckled, "but now we listen first. It's amazing what you learn when you just let people explain." The medical students took notes as Harrison described the changes. One raised his hand. "Did you lose any friends over this?" "Some colleagues weren't happy," Harrison admitted, "but I gained something more important: perspective. And a new friend," he added, smiling at Dr. Bennett. As the group left for their court orientation, Harrison noticed a new case on his afternoon schedule: another doctor with a parking violation. 6 months ago, this would have been a 2-minute hearing. Now, he looked forward to learning the story behind it. Mrs. Rodriguez brought him his afternoon coffee. "You know, Judge, that parking ticket might have been the best mistake you ever made." Harrison looked out his window at the city below. Somewhere out there, Dr. Bennett would soon be saving another life. And here, in his courtroom, he would make sure that justice was served with understanding, compassion, and the wisdom to listen before judging. "Not a mistake, Maria," he corrected gently. "A wake-up call, one that changed not just me, but an entire system, and we're just getting started."